This Fireside CharLA series is brought to you in partnership with United Latinx Fund and the Latino Coalition of Los Angeles. I'm Richard Corral, Interim Executive Director of the United Latinx Fund. This online event series aims to engage, educate, and advocate on important and timely topics that impact LA's Latinx community during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how we can support the local economy as well as help to facilitate the reimagining of public safety. I'd like to quickly thank sponsors for tonight's event, Southern California Gas Company and JP Morgan Chase, for their commitment to and investment in nonprofits like United Latinx Fund that work to transform, uplift, and improve our community's quality of life. Our program is designed to engage you, our audience. So if you have a question, please enter your question in the chat box, and note that everybody's audio and video will be muted until the question and answer session. Also, tonight's program is streaming on Facebook Live. So to access the video, please visit United Latinx Fund's Facebook page, and a link is already provided in the chat box. And please host a watch party and invite your friends. As a matter of fact, here's my Facebook page, and I pulled it up from ULF, and I'm hosting a watch party, and I'm typing in here from LA District Attorney candidate. I'm tagging George Gascon and inviting folks to my watch party. There it is. Oh, I gotta turn that volume down, my bad. Tonight's conversation centers on Los Angeles District Attorney's race and reimagining community safety and policing. The November contest for the LA District Attorney, who oversees the nation's largest prosecutor's office, is being framed as a referendum on criminal justice reform. As hundreds of thousands of protests, police brutality nationwide, and the phrase defund the police moves from the fringes to a topic of debate in LA City Council and the LA County Board of Supervisors, the race is now being reshaped largely around which candidate is best poised to hold law enforcement accountable. So with us tonight is LA District Attorney candidate who previously held a position as Assistant Chief of the LAPD, Chief of Police in Mesa, Arizona, Chief of Police in San Francisco, and most recently, District Attorney for the City and County of San Francisco. District Attorney candidate George Gascon is with us tonight to discuss his proposed agenda to reform and overhaul the LA District Attorney's office and hold law enforcement accountable. Let's get started. Welcome, candidate Gascon. I think you might be on mute, so let's make sure you're unmuted, and welcome, candidate Gascon.
Hi, Richard. Thank you so much. Real pleasure being here today. And before we go on, I'd like to thank both Alejandra and Rochelle for doing the work. None of this would be possible without the people that are doing all the work behind the scenes, and certainly the translation, but also the technical work is important.
Thank you. Let's get started with a few questions for this evening. I know this may seem like perhaps an obvious question, but at times I've been on conversations with you, and sometimes it is worth repeating or clarifying exactly what the responsibilities are of a district attorney, and more specifically, what can a district attorney can and cannot do, so that folks can adjust their expectations based on facts rather than supposition or hearsay.
Great question, Richard. And as you well know, this is a position that holds incredible power. In fact, it's one of the most powerful positions in local government. And yet often people do not understand or realize the import of how much work this position actually controls. So anytime the police makes an arrest, it is the district attorney that determines how that arrest is going to be handled. And this could have tremendous consequences because it could be the difference between being prosecuted or being let go. It could be the difference between going to state prison or getting mental health services. It could be the person between being deported, in the case of many of our immigrant families, or staying home. It also has a tremendous role to play when it comes to police accountability. We know that the current DA is very compromised, very conflicted because of the assistance that she gets from law enforcement. And we have seen, nearly 600 killings in LA County during her time in office and only one prosecution. Also, often people don't realize that the district attorney also plays a role in environmental justice. So LA County is one of the most polluted counties in the country. We know that in many of our Black and brown communities, we have industrial polluters that are impacting the health of our families. And it could be inappropriately capped fossil fuels or oil wells that are emitting poison into the air that is poisoning our families and our lungs and our kids. It could be illegal dumping. It could be an explosion, like a gas explosion in Northern County, where the current district attorney did not do what she needed to do in order to hold Southern California Gas Company accountable. It also involves government accountability. And it's more than just simply police accountability. Police accountability is a big piece, but the district attorney also is the one that is supposed to be the gatekeeper to ensure that if there was public corruption, that there will be consequences for that. And the current DA has also fell short in this area. It also involves ensuring that both the powerful and the influential are being held accountable to the same standard than all of us. And over, we have seen the current district attorney look the other way from some pretty horrific crimes have been committed by very powerful people, including sexual assaults by Hollywood producers, or just reprehensible behavior by individuals that are very influential in our community, and they have been given the pass. Finally, the district attorney plays a tremendous role in influencing public policy and law, both at the local and state level. So while the district attorney is not someone that actually writes law, lawmakers consistently look to district attorneys for guidance concerning criminal justice legislation, and district attorneys often sponsor or fight legislation depending on which direction they want to go. And what we see in LA County, which is the largest county in the country, is we've seen a district attorney that has mass incarcerated large numbers of our community, has caused the deportation of many families, and continues to prosecute children as adults, and continues to do the death penalty. All things that a district attorney, depending who's sitting in that role, can influence going one direction or the other direction. That's why this race is so important.
Thank you, candidate Gascon. And I do want to remind everybody, please put your questions in the chat box. I also want to bring your attention to some helpful resources that Ana is posting that relate to the topics that candidate Gascon is sharing. So please not only check out the chat box for the resources, but also check out the chat box for questions that are being shared by your peers, and we will address those questions as well. Un breve anuncio, por favor, si quiere escuchar este programa en español, por favor seleccione español en el menú debajo. Gracias. So let's begin to sort of unpack and drill down into a few more specifics in terms of, now that you've provided an overview in terms of what you can and cannot do and what is within your purview, let's talk about, based on existing laws, what's currently on the books, what actions can and will you take on day one to overhaul the LA District Attorney's office?
Yeah, there are many things, as I mentioned earlier, where the district attorney, either by action or inaction, can make happen. So, for instance, the law says that we have the death penalty, but it's obviously up to the district attorney to do so. So, in some of my commitments and things that I've already done and will do if I were to be elected is we would no longer prosecute any death penalty cases. We will no longer prosecute children as adults. I believe that not only is it inhumane, it doesn't work. The human brain is not fully developed until we're somewhere in our mid-20s, but when you take children and you prosecute them as adults, all you do is create multiple generations of impacting entire communities and families, and it doesn't necessarily enhance public safety. I also am very committed to holding police accountable. We know that the current district attorney has often looked the other way. I am working with a group of civil rights lawyers, and we're already looking at some of the cases where the current district attorney has refused to prosecute to assess whether these cases are prosecutable. And if they are, we will assign a special prosecutor outside the office to ensure that we have full transparency and independence from looking at those cases. Additionally, I am committed to ending cash bail. So while there is an argument, there's still cash bail is possible in the state, and certainly there is a proposition coming up in November that will reinforce that. As a district attorney, I have a great deal of control in whether I would be seeking money bail from the judges or the courts. And the problem with money bail is money bail doesn't speak to whether somebody's dangerous or whether somebody committed a crime or not. Money bail just simply keeps poor people, those that cannot afford to pay bail, in custody, and it almost turns the system upside down. So you are guilty until proven innocent because you're in custody because you cannot afford to pay bail, and you're in custody until you get proven not to have committed a crime, or you admit to something that perhaps you wouldn't otherwise. So I'm also committed to ending the use of cash bail, certainly for all misdemeanors and all nonviolent offenders. And I plan to work with our defense bar to come up with different solutions for those people that may be dangerous to our community. They may need to be held in custody for pretrial, but doing so not because they can't afford to bail out, but simply because they're dangerous. So to rebut, to kind of, sort of capsulize this, we will end the death penalty. We stop prosecuting juveniles as adults. We will stop using cash bail the way it's being used now. We will begin to treat mental health in a very different way. I don't believe that jail is the right place for those that are mentally ill. Certainly stop criminalizing the poor.
And I think what's so important about this conversation is that for people to be able to see very clearly what are the things, again, on day one that you can actually do, that you actually have an ability to have influence over. And then the question becomes those things that you aren't able to influence and the things that you aren't able to immediately take action on. So in those circumstances, if there are no current laws on the books to help advance your reform agenda, what, if anything, do you plan to be able to do about that?
Yeah, I'm going to do the same thing that I've done before, and that is work with state legislators and the board of supervisors in this case to create new or different legislation that will enable us to provide a different way of approaching our work. So for instance, one of the things that I know that is really critical is that we create a separation from the district attorney's office and who investigates and who determines whether a case against a law enforcement officer should be prosecuted. And if it's going to be prosecuted, that's the prosecution. The law as it's currently written really puts that entire responsibility on the county district attorney. I can create a bypass by appointing a special prosecutor on a case-by-case basis, but that is not a long-term solution. So what I plan to do is work with our legislators in Sacramento to create a legislation that would allow each county, if the county wants to create a separate office, to do this. And then once that vehicle is there, work with our county board of supervisors to make sure that we create an office that will do this work for the entire county. there are other areas that I want to work. So for instance, in the creation, as we reduce incarceration, I want to make sure that the money that is being saved goes to public health, which will in turn help mental health and also for education. Um, the County Board of Supervisors is currently looking to put an initiative on the ballot that would take 10% of our budget to provide other types of services in the community. I want to continue this road. I want to work with our County Board of Supervisors and other stakeholders to get to a place where we continue to reduce, shrink the size of the criminal justice system and be able to shift that funding into education and public health and housing, which I think are much better vehicles in order to provide safety for our community and create more sustainable and livable communities.
I love that you're sort of concluded by speaking about a shift, right? So shifting both budget and responsibility away from law enforcement to other sectors that are perhaps more skilled at addressing those matters. And as a nonprofit organization, United Latinx Fund, as well as our partners on the CharLA, the Latino Coalition of Los Angeles is a 501c4. Both organizations have deep relationships in community, specifically around through nonprofit organizations. And so I'd like to conclude our conversation with the question, what role do nonprofits play in helping to execute your vision around law enforcement and more specifically around community safety?
I think nonprofits play an essential role in my vision, and I believe they play an essential role in creating more livable, more sustainable communities. Nonprofits are the central core of many services that are delivering our community, whether it's assistance with education, whether it's assistance with public health, whether it's assistance with even language access. We know that often nonprofits are the ones that fill in the vacuum where government can or won't do the work. One of my goals is, if I were to be elected district attorney, is actually go through around the county to begin to take an inventory of what are the services that are available to deal with the things that come to the door of the district attorney, like people that have mental health issues, substance abuse problems, and create the capacity to start shifting that work to the nonprofits that are in the place where the place and the capacity exists, where the capacity is not there, to create capacity by having local government, nonprofits, and other community stakeholders working together. I believe deeply that nonprofits are often more nimble, often more able to move in a way that government can't in order to deliver services that are critical, especially for the underserved. We know that it's often, let's take immigration, for instance, we know that often nonprofits are the ones that stay way ahead of the game before any government entity in order to make sure that the immigrant community is provided with legal services, legal representation, that they are sometimes provided access, language access, is sometimes provided with the capacity to get access to health and education. So I believe that it's incumbent upon all of us to work together, but certainly it's really critical that the role of nonprofits play a major component of anything that we do, and certainly anything that I would do as a district attorney.
Thank you for that, and for being very clear from even prior to day one, assuming you were to be elected, to really see nonprofits as a vital partner, and in turn really seeing us, right, as a vital partner, as a nonprofit that invests in, right, as a philanthropy that invests in Latinx serving nonprofits, are at the forefront of addressing many of the issues that are pre-existing conditions, at the forefront of addressing things like housing and jobs, that without that support, oftentimes the choices are limited, and the choices oftentimes result in a higher frequency of engagement with law enforcement. So I'm thankful to hear you thinking in very preventative ways, in ways that are very forward-thinking, to completely reinvent and reimagine how our community really interacts with law enforcement, and hopefully one day community policing, which is an entirely different approach to law enforcement. I'd like to transition to the question and answer session, and what I will do is welcome our partner and the board president of the Latino Coalition, Cindy Villegas, who monitors our chat box and has been closely observing the questions today, and will share with us a few questions from her observations. Cindy, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Victor, for the introduction. And thank you, Candidate Gascon, for taking the time to be here with us today. I have 5 questions from Ari Gutierrez Arambula. One that stuck out to me the most is that she recently has seen a lot of news stories that hundreds of cases were, including the police, were involved in deaths of constituents. The DA states that there are so many cases that they will wait until the victims' families bring the case forward for them to take action. What would be your approach to address this backlog of cases and really just welcome families to feel like they could come forward and there's something that's going to be done in regards to their case rather than be dismissed?
Yeah, thank you so much, Cindy, and thank you, Ari, for raising that question, because you bring a really important point in the distinction between myself and the current occupant of the DA's office, and that is being proactive and understanding that responsibility for government and police accountability lies on your lap and not on the community's lap. And I think it's really critical that the district attorney not just simply be a passive observer waiting for somebody to bring a complaint, but actually someone that is going to actively be looking for things that need to be addressed through the legal system. In addition to that, I recognize that, I'm not always going to see everything that goes on. And definitely it's really important to have a very open dialogue with the community in general. And again, going back to nonprofits and other organizations that sometimes are going to serve as the conduit for that communication. So having open, transparent, and constant communication with all of our communities to make sure that people feel empowered to bring a complaint, to raise issues that need to be looked upon, it's actually happening. So I see it as two components. Number one, I think the district attorney needs to be proactive in doing his or her work to ensure that accountability through the system, including police accountability, is taking place. But I think there's also another component, is that transparency and sort of the open door that welcomes people to come in and raise their concerns and bring things to the attention of the office that for whatever reason the DA missed.
Thank you so much. And Rashad, if you can be so kind, I would like to give Ari an opportunity. Sorry for the background noise. Ari Gutierrez to respond. So if you can please unmute her, give her opportunity to respond.
And we just want to make sure that our Q&A doesn't go over. So Adi, if you could please keep your response very concise so we can continue with the program. Thank you, Adi.
Sure. Yeah, well, I appreciate that. In terms of the, you're saying that you would take a different approach, but I've heard some very passionate appeals, and I know that a lot of community members have been visiting the office of the current DA, I think weekly on Wednesdays. So it just doesn't make any sense, and so hopefully we are able to make some sort of a systematic change to how the community can bring up issues of concern in terms of things that may have happened with the police involved.
No, I agree with you, Ari, 100%. Obviously people have the right and should be able to demonstrate in front of government buildings, but That should only be when access hasn't been provided, and I look forward to providing access. Understanding sometimes you're still going to have protests, but not because of the lack of access.
Thank you. Cindy, do we have any other questions from our participants? I think Cindy might have.
Yes, yes, we do have a question from Ricardo Mirales. Ricardo is asking, how can the new DA address significant oversight and collaboration levels between Los Angeles Police Department and the LA Sheriff Department?
Okay, and Ricardo, before I go on, are you asking how should the DA work to bring the two departments to the conversation, or how should the DA bring the conversation, insert himself or herself in a conversation with two agencies? I just want to make sure I'm responsive.
Ricardo?
Yeah, thanks. I just got turned on, and I'm honored to be able to join this conversation. But in terms of that clarification, it just seems to me, and I'm with the charter school that's in the city, but that there's such a difference of how the LAPD is interacting with the various level of the community and its oversight with the city council versus the sheriffs. The sheriff has all this tension with the county supervisors. It's almost like they're in another world. So if a person were to cross the street, whether they're on the LAPD side or the sheriff side, it's going to be a completely different world in terms of how the DA deals with them. And just as further evidence, let me cite two things. One is the article that came out in the Times yesterday about all the money that's been paid to address the issues in the sheriff department through their clicks. And second, also a recognition of the history that you have with the LAPD. So just basically, to your point, there is such different worlds. And for our citizens, for the people that our community, that the folks on this call address, we're constantly crossing between LAPD and sheriff, and yet it's almost like two different worlds. And so how is the DA, which covers both of them, how can you address that difference?
Yeah, and I clearly get your question now, Ricardo. And obviously it's a combination of things. Number one, I think that it's really important for the DA to be very clear in what his or her expectations are of law enforcement in terms of adhering to the law, to constitutional policing, and that doesn't matter what agency you work with, right? Because in addition to the LAPD and the sheriff, there are 40 some other policing agencies in the county, and everybody needs to understand that how you get treated by police in terms of your constitutional rights should not be dependent upon which side of the street you're on. So to that point, you raise a really something that obviously the DA has some role to play by just simply on his or her expectation and how they would do their job. The second part is more nuanced, and is perhaps the one where, just a power of influence, having conversations with people and trying to get people to the table to adhere to a different code of ethics and a different way of working. And that obviously is more complicated, especially when it comes to the sheriff department, because unlike the LAPD, where the chief of police works for the mayor and in part to the city council and the police commission, the sheriff is an independently elected official. In fact, if you look at the state constitution, there are only two, at the county level, there really are two constitutional officers. It's the sheriff and the DA, and they're each independently elected. And the only control that the board of supervisors has over the sheriff is over budget. And the rest of the control really starts to be more up to the voters in a way, or certainly for the DA to hold the sheriff accountable if the sheriff is to commit any criminal violations. So it's a complicated dance. The two agencies that they get that within the government structure are governed by very different rules. And that's always been the problem between the LAPD and the sheriff department, not necessarily in the terms of how they treat people, but the structural governance, because they are different governmental bodies. Although for the people on the street, policing service. It doesn't matter whether it comes from Montebello PD, LAPD, or the sheriff or West Covina Police Department, right? So I see my role, if I were to be elected, as one of holding a very clear line on what the expectations are and holding people accountable. as to constitutional policing, as to the capacity of people to work better together and perhaps have better policies. It's more of a one of influential and working through policy development with the various agencies and the city councils and mayors and the board of supervisors, which I certainly plan to do and be very engaged in. But I don't want to overpromise either, because there are complexity there, and I think it's important. You know, part of this CharLA, if you will, is that we are also educating our community, and it's important for the community to understand that when you elect a sheriff or a district attorney, you are electing an independent person that you put all your faith and trust in, and you hope that they are going to do the things that you hope that they will do. So when you vote for them, it's important that you pay attention to who you're voting for, and understand that if you don't vote, you still are voting, right, one way or the other. Because I think, you know, people often say, well, you know, especially I know some very close friends of mine in the Latino community say, well, you know, it doesn't matter anyway, you know, it's just a vote. They said, well, no, it does matter. If you don't vote, what you did is you actually pass on your vote to somebody else that is going to vote for him or her and you. And if you vote, then it's important that you also do so responsibly and understand that these roles are very critical. You know, I try to be extremely upfront about what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do, because if you vote for me, I want you to understand what you're voting for, right? I tell people, look, if you believe in the death penalty, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I tell people, for instance, if you believe in the death penalty, don't vote for me, because I am an abolitionist when it comes to the death penalty, right? So I try to be very transparent, but it's important for the voters to understand that you're voting for a person, you're voting for certain things. And when you vote for a sheriff, you're getting what you voted for or didn't.
So I wanted to first off thank candidate Gascon for that detailed response to Ricardo. And as an aside, Ricardo actually is the former board president of the United Latinx Fund. So it's very meaningful to have sort of the multiple different generations of this organization still engaged and still supporting and still very much taking leadership and being impacted by the topics that are being discussed on this CharLA. So the relevance and the timeliness and the intergenerational elements and components of the work that we do are very much present today. And to that end, I do want to wrap up so that we can open up the mixer. And I've seen so many amazing questions still coming through as we speak. So that tells me that folks really do want to get to the mixer and have a more unscripted conversation. So if you could just bear with me for 1 minute, I'll wrap up. And first want to thank first our team, the Latino Coalition of Los Angeles, for working diligently and supporting tonight's conversation, as well as the United Latinx Fund team. And as a reminder, as always, we do encourage everybody who's joining us on these CharLAs to support the Campaign for Nonprofit Resilience. Cindy will provide a link to the campaign. Many of you are familiar with the campaign to ensure that grassroots nonprofits who primarily serve communities of color can withstand the current crises. We now have over 1,200 signatures from community leaders who've already signed on to the campaign, and we encourage all of our guests, including our candidate, to sign up and to spread the word so that we can collectively reach 2,000 signatures and ensure the sustainability and the longevity of vital nonprofits that candidate Gascon this evening spoke about as essential to executing his vision. Also, please tune in to next week's CharLA, when we will be joined by Alex Sanchez and Skip Townsend from Homies Unidos to discuss Black-Brown violence, as well as recent incidences that center around street vendors, our local entrepreneurs, as well as some of the incidences around policing and police violence. Increasingly, we see here in the city of Los Angeles the need to really work collaboratively across Black, Brown communities. And Alex Sanchez and Skip Townsend are experts when it comes to not only working peacefully across communities like gangs through gang interventions, as well as in a more broader sense, how to keep the peace and how to empower our communities collectively. We want to ensure that these topics work and are addressed to address violence. And we want to make sure that you're engaged to help support their efforts, as well as how to plug in and advance that work.